On Primetime Politics tonight, the finance minister has unveiled her long-awaited fiscal update, a snapshot of the nation's economic outlook in an era of spiking COVID cases, spiking inflation, and spiking uncertainty. Hello, I'm Peter Van Dusen. This is a special edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. The fiscal update really focusing on carrying the country through the pandemic and a lot less on big-ticket promises. They'll have to wait for another day. The update reveals a lower deficit than predicted in the last budget and sets aside some $30 billion over the next 6 years to deal with the pandemic. As expected, there's one new big spending piece for Indigenous child welfare, $40 billion set aside for that. And to underscore where we are, the finance minister had to deliver the update virtually today because two of her staff members have tested positive for COVID-19.
This economic and fiscal update provides Canadians with a transparent report of our nation's finances. It also includes targeted investments that will ensure we have the weapons we need to finish the fight against COVID-19.
Coming up on our program, the Associate Minister of Finance, Randy Boissonault, will be here to defend the government's fiscal approach, which includes two possible scenarios for the economic recovery based on the continuing impact of COVID-19. We'll also hear from the opposition parties, economists, Indigenous leaders, and MPs will debate the government's fiscal approach. But first, let's quickly go through some of the key highlights of the fiscal update. Let's start with the deficit projections. The fiscal update revises last year's budget deficit from nearly $355 billion to less than $328 billion. And for this year, the deficit projection is now pegged at $144.5 billion, $10 billion below the previous forecast. The deficit projection for next year is set at $58 billion, falling to $13 billion by 2027. The improved fiscal picture is thanks to a rebounding economy, leading to higher than expected government revenues along with lower than expected spending on COVID-19 programs. The fiscal update also lowers the predicted debt to GDP ratio by 3 to 4 points over the next few years when compared to the April budget, but those numbers could be affected if the economic recovery is slower than predicted. The forecast for economic growth has increased now to 4.2% for next fiscal year and 2.8% in 2023. But again, those numbers are wrapped in uncertainty because of COVID-19, lasting supply chain challenges, and the lasting impacts of flooding in British Columbia. The fiscal update also promises more than $8 billion in new spending, $1.7 billion to provinces and territories for rapid testing supplies, $2 billion over 2 years for the procurement of therapeutic treatments, $742 million for one-time payments to low-income seniors who've received pandemic benefits and then saw their guaranteed income supplements clawed back. There's also a new $60 million fund to support artists and performers. That's a condition of the Bloc Québécois support for the government's latest COVID-19 support package now before Parliament. A new tax credit to allow small businesses to improve ventilation and air filtration, $1.3 billion in new spending over 6 years to expand Afghan resettlement efforts, $50 million to relieve supply chain congestion in Canada, and $85 million to reduce immigration backlogs. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Chrystia Freeland delivered her economic update virtually today after two of her staff members tested positive for COVID-19. The minister herself has tested negative. She also spoke with reporters earlier this afternoon virtually, and she was asked why she didn't use the windfall in revenues to drive down the deficit further.
We are going to do what we promised Canadians we would do. I would point out that that platform was fully costed, and it's a platform for our full mandate.
This fiscal update includes limited new spending. The finance minister asked when Canadians should expect the federal government to ramp up billions more in spending for promises made during the election campaign.
This is not the master plan for the Canadian economy going forward. That will be in the budget. In this plan, there is some spending, but that is spending which is very carefully targeted at having the tools to finish fighting COVID. I don't think any Canadian will regret our spending on things like rapid tests, on things like therapeutics.
Edmonton Liberal MP Randy Boissonault is Canada's Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance. He is with me now. Mr. Boissonault, good to see you, and congratulations on your appointment to Cabinet.
Thanks very much, Peter. Nice to be here.
What is the overriding message your government wants to convey to Canadians in this fiscal update?
I think the overwhelming message, Peter, is pretty straightforward, and it's that we have a transparent update of the nation's finances, and we want to finish the fight against COVID. We want to make sure that we continue to double down on affordability for life for Canadians. We want to ensure that our economic recovery leaves nobody behind. And so those are the three big baskets, if you will. It also tells a story of great work done by Canadians and an economic plan that has worked. You know that the government made historic investments in Canadians to save lives and livelihoods. And we're seeing the results of those investments play out now in the economic fundamentals and in the health of the economy. It's not equal across the board. But if you take a look at the fact that the size of the economy is now almost $2.5 trillion, it's exactly the place where the government projected it would be in the 2018 budget. And so that means the economy is back on track, even as we are working very hard to put COVID behind us.
Let's pick up on that. The economy, as you pointed out, it did better than expected, and the government in the fiscal update acknowledges it spent less on the COVID-19 response than it had budgeted so far. And so that's left the government with a $10 billion windfall of sorts. And I guess I'm wondering, why is the government spending that money instead of, even though the deficit is coming down, why not put even more of that money against the deficit, another $10 billion perhaps?
I think the answer to that question, Peter, is the fight's not over. And if you take a look at the $30 billion represented in this economic and fiscal update, about $10 billion of it goes to finishing the fight on COVID. So if we look at the numbers, we're looking at making sure that booster shots are free for all Canadians in all provinces and territories. We're making sure that we have the pediatric vaccines to make sure that children over 5 can get vaccinated. It's millions of rapid tests for provinces, municipalities, territories, and Indigenous communities. It's making sure that we invest in the antiretroviral drugs to make sure that Canadians can be safe and that patients can avoid even being hospitalized or further hospitalized. And it's also the supports that are in the legislation in front of the House right now, Peter, C2 and C3. So the lockdown support and the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit, as well as the as well as the 10-day sick leave provision. So there's a lot in the window, and the reason we need to keep investing in Canadians is we have to get through the pandemic so that we can have an even more robust economic recovery once we get through the pandemic. And
the latest developments on Omicron, underscore that we're not done yet. But look, let's talk a little bit about inflation here. There's the whole argument over this notion of profiting from inflation. Most of the additional revenue brought in to lower the deficit by $10 billion came from increased GST revenues on the stuff people have been buying. Is the government profiting off the spike in inflation?
Well, we know, Peter, that inflation is a global phenomenon, and any revenues that come into government coffers from economic activity, we are investing in Canadians right now, and we're investing in affordability. You know the price tag, the investment tag, if you will, on investing in childcare. It's $30 billion. We want all of those moms to be able to be part of the workforce and to help grow the economy. So for us, it's about making sure that the wise investments are being in, making sure that we work on housing affordability. We know that's an issue for Canadians. And it also means, doing things like boosting the Canada Child Benefit and making sure that as the global supply chains around the world and as, we get the economy started around the world, there's going to be some bumps along the way. It's easier to shut down a global economy than it is to build it again.
Okay. What's in this fiscal update, to help Canadians deal with affordability challenges right now? We talked about the spike in inflation, the price of groceries, energy prices, housing, and more. What's your government doing to deal with that? If there's some of the criticism you heard today is that there's lots of stuff to deal with COVID, and clearly that's a pressing priority. But people are looking to this fiscal update today and saying, what does it do to help me with affordability today?
Well, I think what the update does is it gives a clear picture to Canadians about how we've done as an economy. I mean, what we can say, Peter, is 106% of jobs have been recovered. We had 154,000 jobs announced in November, and that's a good news story for Canadians. I think what we can say, and I know this from my tourism responsibilities, is C2 is really important. We're talking about $7.4 billion to help the hardest hit sectors get through this winter and into the spring so that they can have a tourism sector that's going to help. And we're talking about tens of thousands of businesses, of people who are paying mortgage and rent and just want to make sure that they know that they're supported through that time. And that's why we really want to see the Conservatives and members of the House support C2, because there are supports in there for Canadians.
Okay, let's. You talked about your role as tourism minister. Let me ask you, because I know the Prime Minister and premiers are talking this evening about the impacts of Omicron and what other measures might have to be taken. What do you think we should expect to hear?
Well, I know this: safety first and travel follows. And our responsibility is to keep Canadians safe. It's what we've done through this whole pandemic, and we will always make sure that we take the steps that we need to keep our families and our neighbors safe. And it's also incumbent upon us to make sure that the traveling public is safe, Peter. And from a tourism minister's perspective, I want to make sure that when we're through with the pandemic, we preserve what we've built, which is literally the safest place on the earth to travel to. And it does mean that if we see Omicron continue to grow, we're going to have to double down on C2. We're going to have to make sure it's implemented. We're going to have to support the tourism businesses and the families connected to it, and make sure that we come out of this stronger than ever before.
So, notwithstanding what was talked about in the fiscal update today, you're signaling that if we head into the kind of territory we were in a year ago with the pandemic, your government's being accused of dialing back pandemic benefits. You're suggesting that if you need to roll out more of them, that's going to be there.
I think the government has demonstrated its capacity to understand the information, to follow what's happening with the pandemic, and we make those decisions as the data and as the information comes to us. And what I do know is that we need the support of people in the House of Commons to pass the $7.4 billion C2, which will help the hardest hit sectors right now in the tourism sector. And Peter, these are businesses that asked us for this help because they knew that the tourists, the international tourists, wouldn't be able to come to the degree that they've been here before. And so we heard those entrepreneurs, we heard those business owners, and that's why we have C2 in front of us. We will continue to listen to Canadians, and we'll see what this winter and what the spring throws at us and be ready to respond.
All right, Randy Boissonault, Canada's Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance. Thanks for your time tonight, Minister. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter. All the best.
Well, the official opposition described today's fiscal update as a failure that doesn't deal with the affordability challenges facing Canadians today. Here's Conservative leader Erin O'Toole.
Minister Freeland hopes that Canadians are not paying attention to just inflation. Good for his budget, bad for yours. After having spent $500 billion, the Liberal government is celebrating a massive $144 billion deficit and only a modest recovery from an economy that had literally stopped a year ago. Instead of addressing the inflation crisis, instead of dealing with the cost of living crisis impacting millions of Canadians, Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal government will continue to make life more expensive for Canadian families and seniors. They're planning taxes of sale of homes. They're taxing and increasing taxes on January 1st. They will spend tens of billions of dollars with very little oversight or accountability. They are driving investment out of Canada, and they have failed Canadian workers repeatedly on pipelines, on softwood lumber, on agriculture, on steel, aluminum, Buy America, and the auto industry. This fall economic statement is an admission by the Trudeau government that they have no economic plan, just more debt, declining investment, and out-of-control prices saddled on the backs of families. The economy of Justin Trudeau is heading off the rails and is failing millions of Canadians who are being left behind. That's why Canada's Conservatives cannot support today's fall economic statement.
Spending, Mr. O'Toole, and if so, where would you cut? Because it seems with the Omicron coming, the economy might need more support, not less. So where would you cut if you're going to be cutting spending?
This is about making sure we use the fact that a vast majority of our population is vaccinated. We have the most effective tool that we've been promoting people to use for the last year. We can follow public health guidance and find the right balance to keep people safe, reduce spread, ensure we keep hospitalizations down, but also make sure we focus on the economy, on businesses that are hurting, and keeping the economy moving. This is something that I don't see a clear signal from the government on. I think you can use the fact that we have 80% plus vaccinated to make sure we don't go back into CERB and other programs that would actually hold our economy back when we've got a level of debt on the backs of our children, and we're months away from interest rate increases that will cripple many families and will slowly hurt the government's ability to spend on critical needs.
Well, let's turn now to reaction from the Democratic Party. NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh is with me now. Mr. Singh, good to see you again, and thanks for your time tonight to take time to speak with me. You had, some expectations for this economic update. How does the fiscal and economic update meet those expectations you had?
Well, I look at what we're going through right now, and I think about Canadians that are worried about Omicron and what that means for their families. They're worried about lockdowns and maybe losing their jobs. They can't afford to pay their bills, and they certainly can't afford to find a home that's in their budget, with the inflation driving up the cost of living. And in this context, the response from this fiscal update does not meet the urgency of what people are going through. We've had people that are struggling with the clawbacks of their GIS. These are vulnerable seniors and people that have seen the clawback of their child benefits. They have been struggling with this for months. The Liberals have known about this since May. We've been raising and fighting back against this cut since August. And there's a vague commitment for a one-time payment in the future at some point, which does not deal with the urgency of what people are going through. Nothing in this budget to tackle the house flipping as they promised to do, or foreign buyers, or an end to blind bidding. All measures which we would have supported to help people find a home they can afford.
All right.
They've cut help to people at a time when the Omicron variant might be the worst of what we've experienced since the beginning of this pandemic. And that's why we said from the beginning, we shouldn't be cutting help to people when we're still in this pandemic. And sadly, it looks like some of the worst of this pandemic might be ahead of us.
Okay, let's pick up a couple of things you've said there. You touched on the clawbacks of the guaranteed income supplement for Canadian seniors. The fiscal update does commit $742 million to seniors who had their income supplement clawed back because they received pandemic benefits. They're promising this one-time payment to seniors who lost money. So your concern is that it's not. What did you want the update to say? A one-time payment that they'll receive by, January 15th or something more precise?
We need it immediately. And these are people, we're hearing from stories, and this is probably one of the most heartbreaking stories that we've heard from. People on GIS are already inherently the most vulnerable seniors. That they need to be on the guaranteed income supplement means they're amongst the lowest income seniors in our country. Their GIS being clawed back, these are people that are literally living on the brink, month to month, paycheck to pay, or support check to support check. And for them to have seen that clawed back for the past number of months, and in this fiscal update, the promise to be a one-time payment, who knows when, that is not responding to how urgent things are for these folks. And that to me is an abysmal failure. We needed to see a commitment immediately so that families can predict, so that seniors can predict when would they get the supports they need so they can actually make their payments.
On the pandemic,
see an immediate response to the housing crisis.
Okay, on the pandemic supports, there is the bill currently before Parliament, which you say is inadequate. The fiscal update and the finance minister has left open the possibility that if the government needs to do more, it may have to do more, and it's prepared to do more. Why isn't that good enough?
Well, the vagueness of that response in the face of what we're going through. Why didn't this government put in place what they promised to do? The blind bidding, the foreign buyers tax, the tax on house flipping, all measures which we said we would support, we agree with. In fact, we campaigned similarly on putting in such measures so that we could stop the rising, skyrocketing prices of housing. None of those measures were in this. despite the fact that inflation has been dominating the news, and it is one of the biggest drivers of making life more unaffordable. And amongst inflation, housing has been the biggest impact on people's lives. Nothing to address that. It is probably the single most biggest concern in people's lives right now is the cost of living, and housing is foremost. No measures to actually do anything concretely to deal with that.
I mean,
is
the
a failure of leadership to respond to the crisis.
The implication is, you know, in talking to the government side, is that you know, these are things you'd more properly expect to see in a budget, and we expect that sometime in the spring or, you know, late winter. You're saying that that's too long to wait. The action needs to happen now.
Yeah, why wait when we're in a serious crisis right now? And the seriousness can't be understated. We are in one of the worst housing crises that we've seen ever in our country. The inflation rates are driving up the cost of housing. People cannot find a place to call home. And there are measures that this government campaigned on. They promised to do big things. They said, in fact, Mr. Trudeau said, I'm calling this election because we need to do big things. Well, there's nothing big announced in this fiscal update. And the biggest problems that we're up against, there's no solutions to those in this fiscal update. And there could have been. We've said really clearly we would support measures to tackle the housing crisis. We would support measures to tax banks like they promised to do. Why wasn't that mentioned in the fiscal update? We said that we should be taxing the billionaires and those at the very top. The Liberals came back with, okay, we'll tax banks and insurance companies. That wasn't in the fiscal update. That would seem to make sense. How are we going to pay for the cost of some of these things? We should be taxing profitable banks and insurance companies.
A couple of quick things to finish on. There's a commitment to set aside $40 million to deal with the compensation and reforms related to First Nations child welfare system. What's your reaction to that?
That is a positive sign that the government is going to stop their ongoing approach, which has been to fight Indigenous kids in court. And so that's promising. I want to make sure that those that are involved, that represent the children, are satisfied and that there's a resolution. And this seems to be a promising step forward. But I look towards the AFN and Cindy Blackstock and those that represent the children to make sure that this is in line with what they want to see happen. But let's not forget that these children were, according to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, both willfully and recklessly discriminated against. Given how egregious that is and how the lack of equal funding resulted in their horrible treatment, there needs to be justice, and there seems to be a willingness to move forward. I want to thank everyone that's raised their voices and stood up for these Indigenous children. And this seems like a positive step, but we don't know exactly if this is going to be in line with what the community wants, but it seems to be positive.
And you mentioned Cindy Blackstock. We're going to hear from her coming up in our program this evening, so that's good timing. Look, let me ask you about one other thing here. Bill 21 in Quebec. You said today, I think for the first time, that if the federal government decides to challenge this Quebec law when it gets to the federal court system, if it gets to the federal court system, that you would support that federal court challenge and look to join it as an intervener. Why are you taking that position now?
Well, I said a couple of things. I want to be really clear. I've always been opposed to this. I've always said it's something that hurts people. And what happened in Chelsea really highlights that it is a moment now to make it clear that if this case right now that's being challenged in Quebec by Quebecers, if it makes it to the Supreme Court of Canada, then Canada the Canadian government should be an intervener and should support the Quebecers, the 3 million Quebecers who are opposed to this law, and the current the folks in Quebec that are fighting this discriminatory law. We should support them. If it makes it to the Supreme Court, the Canadian government should intervene and support those Quebecers.
All right. NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh, thanks for your time tonight. Mr. Singh, we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Well, the fiscal update does promise $40 billion over the next 5 years for child welfare reform in First Nations. Roughly half of that money will go towards children who had been placed in care and their families for settling compensation orders from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and from class action lawsuits. The other half will go toward longer-term reforms to the Indigenous child welfare system. Cindy Blackstock has been at the forefront in the fight to win compensation for First Nations children for the past 15 years. She's the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. Cindy Blackstock, first of all, thanks for taking time to speak with me today. So we now have this $40 billion commitment from the federal government for compensation and reform of the First Nations child welfare system. The money's being set aside, and I want to know what your reaction is to that commitment.
Well, it's an encouraging sign because we know that this litigation has been going on for 15 years, and there's kind of two buckets that the public really should know about. One is the compensation you're talking about, Peter. That's for the kids who are hurt by Canada's inequitable provision of public services, particularly child welfare. The government underfunded those services for decades, and that drove children into care unnecessarily. The other piece is that children were denied basic public services, things as crazy as capping the number of feeding tubes and catheters that kids could get. It was crazy. So $20 billion of that is to compensate the kids who are hurt. In many ways, the most important money is actually about making sure that this is the last generation of First Nations kids who's hurt by Canada. And that's going to require additional investments in child and family services, in things like Jordan's Principle, but also importantly, reform of the department itself. It has got to stop this behavior. It could have fixed this problem 20 years ago and chose not to do it.
Let me ask you, you've touched on it, but there are some Canadians I know who may not fully understand what happened to First Nations kids who will be compensated with this money. Can I get you to briefly explain what happened to them so that Canadians watching have a better understanding of why this case was so important, why this challenge was so important, why the reform is so important?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the federal government funds public services for First Nations, whereas the provinces and territories do for all others. And they've done so at far lesser levels ever since the country was formed. So in the wake of residential schools, you had families that were really trying to recover from that trauma, but they actually had far fewer resources across the board in order to do that. That meant that there were more First Nations kids in care than at the height of residential schools. It became in some ways a new kind of residential schools. And back in 2000, we worked with the federal government, we costed it out. And at that time, they were spending 70 cents on the dollar compared to what other kids were receiving. And those inequalities were just really making things very difficult for families. It was about not having the services to deal with the trauma and then being judged often by a public who didn't know any better as if you got more.
All right, you're saying the billion set aside for reform of the Indigenous child welfare system. It may be the bigger piece of the funding announcement. What does that reform need to look like?
Yeah, the reform really we need to get at the drivers, why First Nations kids are overrepresented. And they're really things like poverty and poor housing, which are right within the bailiwick of the Department of Indian Affairs to fix in terms of on reserve. And things like substance misuse and domestic violence related to the multi-generational trauma of residential schools. If we really get adequate and culturally based services in to deal with those things, and then additional help for young people who have been in the child welfare system or who are now young adults who have come from that child welfare system, then we begin to put in place a holistic response that will give these families a chance to care for their kids in culturally based ways.
We are hearing that a deal is close on the compensation piece, and not sure you can tell us very much the details about that. But I'm wondering if I can ask what still needs to be negotiated. What are the areas, the broad areas that are still before all of the negotiators, the people involved in this process? And I know you're very close to it, and where we are in terms of what still needs to be figured out.
I can just speak to the Caring Society's positions, and we've been very public about this. People need to know that this compensation actually arises out of a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order and that was affirmed by the federal court. So there's a group of victims who are actually entitled to $40,000 even before these negotiations started. We want to see for the children who have been hurt by Canada and are entitled under these orders to actually get that $40,000 as the floor. And then they can get additional funds for the harms they experienced. The other important thing we need to think about, Peter, is these victims sadly are still children in many cases. And so when people think about the residential schools piece, where there was a payment for everybody, and then there was a process of interviewing people to find out what kind of harms they went through to be able to give them additional funding, Well, we can't ethically do that with kids. We can't ask children how they've been harmed. And so we have to find ways of using publicly available information that we know in child welfare usually means higher harms for children to cost that out, because it would just be so traumatizing and so unethical to interview kids.
So, I mean, it sounds like, and the government has implied as much, that this is $40 billion set aside to deal with this, but it sounds like there's the possibility, if not the likelihood, that that number could go higher.
It could. In fact, just if we look at the numbers of children in care that we're dealing with in this group, and there are other children who are denied services through Jordan's principle who are also owing compensation, we're talking between 50 and 60,000 children between 2006 and 2019. So that's a large group of kids who are deserving compensation. That's bigger than some cities and towns. That's the gravity of the harm that was done here.
Let's finish on this. You've been at this fight for 15 years. And so I'm gathering, I gather there's a fair sense of relief, although there's still many questions to be asked. But what lessons do you think have been learned?
You know, I think the lesson that needs to be learned is that when government becomes aware of the discriminatory practices, even things like water that are currently right before them, where they are aware of it and there are solutions to fix it, they should fix it right away, because that fixing it, yes, it's going to cost money, but it will cost far more down the line. To fix this back 24 years ago would have been in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and there would have been no compensation owed because there would have been no victims of Canada's discrimination. Now we're talking in the tens of billions of dollars and the countless human cost of children frankly having died, many of them grown out without their families, and others being denied services. So it's do better when you know better. That should be the key lesson. And we need to see the government and inequalities in these other areas, because if not, we'll have another generation of kids who's still going to be under this kind of hardship.
All right. Cindy Blackstock, always good to talk to you. Thanks again for your time tonight. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Well, let's get a bit of a reality check from our next guest. Kevin Page is Canada's first parliamentary budget officer, now heads the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. He is with me now. Kevin Page, good to see you again. Always good to have you on these days of consequence for the country, when we get economic updates and days when we have budgets and so on. So let me just start there. What stands out for you in what you saw from the Finance Minister today?
Yeah, a significant document in that we needed this update. A lot of uncertainty with this new variant. We know, the economy is a little bit weaker than what people thought maybe in the last budget. The global economy is a little bit weaker. A lot of concerns about inflation. So there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, going around into this document. So the government, effectively chose to produce more of an economic and fiscal update. Here's the state of the finances. Here's our economic planning outlook, and in a modest amount of measures.
Yeah. What did you see that might have been missing in it? Is there something you expected to see that's not there?
Yeah, I think with all this uncertainty and a lot of talk about inflation, I think there was a sense that maybe there was a missed opportunity, and in terms of the government sort of setting its policy. We heard yesterday from the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Bank of Canada about a renewal of a mandate, so we know how the Bank of Canada will be focused on dealing with the inflation issue. But we didn't really get much new today on how the Government of Canada will deal with inflation from a point of view of fiscal policy.
Let me ask you about the mandate tweak, if I can put it that way, for the Bank of Canada. Yes, keep inflation in the 1 to 3 range, typically at 2%, but also factor in your interest rate decisions with the notion of full employment in mind, or maximum employment. Is that a significant change to you? Does that make sense? Is it already common practice? How do you view it?
Yeah, ironically, it could be a little bit of all. And we think there's still the expectation that the Bank of Canada is going to be focused on that 2% target, and that's going to want to anchor inflationary expectations around that 2%. The idea of a dual mandate, having another variable like employment, that in this case, the way they define it as a maximum sustainable employment number, is not something that anybody really observes, like the CPI. We can observe the CPI when it's released by Statistics Canada. So this is an estimate that the bank will have to release and have to speak to. So I think from the point of view of communicating monetary policy, it's going to be a little bit more complicated now because you have these dual variables, like the 2% target in employment.
The finance minister says she's said today aware of the impact of rising inflation, but look, it's a global problem, largely a temporary problem, although how long temporary isn't quite clear, tied to the resurgent economy and that was flattened by the pandemic. But how big of a problem, in your view, is inflation, and what is this government doing about it? Is it, or what should it be doing about it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's sort of like the the economic numbers, the fiscal numbers. Inflation's been really quite volatile. Like again, if you go back, you look at those year-over-year rates and the CPI rate of inflation. We were actually talking about deflation a little bit more than a year ago, where inflation literally had disappeared. And then I think people were just surprised by just how fast it shot up since the summer. Again, a lot of that's energy, and some of those energy prices are starting to moderate now, so we'll see some moderation. A lot of it's supply related, and some of that tied to supply is related to housing. And I think there is a general concern that that household balance sheets were so boosted in 2020 that consumers are sitting on, and there's some pent up demand, that they're just sitting on a lot of money that potentially they could push, what economists call demand pull kind of inflation going forward. So there's a number of factors, and I think government is struggling with its affordability narrative right now.
Why?
Well, I think it's, again, I think they're aware from a political perspective that Canadians are now really noticing it. They're noticing it at the pump. They're noticing when they go to the grocery stores. Canadians are noticing when they're trying to buy a house. It's just like it is everywhere. And at the same time, again, they sort of front-end loaded their policy, I think, to deal with this inflation issue by boosting disposable incomes in 2020. And right now, it's like, well, we've spent enough, and like people are saying, well, what else are you going to do? And they're saying, well, we're going to start tapering some of our spending programs going forward.
Interesting. We didn't see any of the big expensive election promises mentioned in the update that we were told will come. The implication is will come in the next budget. When what you saw today, do the fiscal fundamentals support much larger increases going forward in government spending?
Probably not. Yeah, I would say. I think the government is making almost some political hay that the employment numbers have been quite strong. Like we saw some strong labor releases from the labor force survey. Like more than the jobs have been recouped relative to the pre-COVID levels. Their total employment has bounced back above. And I think like the recovery numbers, they're assuming that we're going to grow this year about 4.5%. The growth will be real growth will be higher by another 4% next year. And so there's a fair bit of stimulus already built in, so to speak, into the next few years from budget 2021. So do we really need a lot more? I think the government has to be careful that if there's going to be more spending, then it has to have more of an investment feel to it than a consumption feel to it. Because, again, consumption, people will spend that money quickly. It will boost inflation. Investment with the hope that we'll get higher productivity growth in the future.
And yet pointing again today to the debt to GDP ratio, which the fiscal outlook suggests will over the next 5 or 6 years, continue on a downward track, maybe even better than what the government had hoped for previously. Can they hang their hat on that?
No, I mean, I think it's hard to hang your hat on these numbers because there's still this uncertainty of, we're still in COVID, and people are talking about fifth wave, and they're worried about this latest variant. People are worried about lockdowns. So this has a negative impact on growth because it slows up investment. So that debt to GDP ratio, it's at 48% now. When we were probably talking about these numbers, Peter, a couple of years ago, it was at 30%. So it's a big increase. If you look at debt interest charges, they're still low in nominal terms because of low interest rates. But like we're going to go from $20 to $40 billion over the next 7 years on public debt interest charges. And so you think about like an extra $20 billion a year we'll be spending on this interest in the public debt. And that's with a pretty low interest rate forecast.
Just drilling down a bit on the numbers, I want to finish on this. The fiscal update commits $40 billion to settle the compensation reform issues around the Indigenous child welfare system. The update notes that $9.6 billion of that amount announced just yesterday, it's actually was actually announced and was actually booked into the last fiscal year, which ended in March, even though the government announced it's going to be spending the money, at some point in the future. Is that creative accounting, or is that the way it's done, or is that okay?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to it. I'm not sure how creative it is. I think there's a precedent for doing these things. If there's a legal case and a liability is firmly established, and in this case with First Nations children, it's going back through the work of Cindy Blackstock and I think also class action suits. It probably goes back several decades. There's many tens and tens of thousands of children and families of First Nations people that are affected by this. There's a big payout. Actually, I think the payout that they socked away for 2020-21 is $16 billion. You're right, they've kind of set aside $9 billion, so they've had to boost it. But there's a forward-looking part. Right. So the government is saying today that they're going to boost spending for First Nations child well-being, and about $4 billion a year each year over the next 5 years.
All right. Always great to get your perspective. Kevin Page, thanks again. Good to see you.
Thank you, Peter.
And earlier today, journalists and some economists were gathered in Ottawa to get an advance look at the fiscal update under embargo. CPAC's Martin Stringer spoke with Robert Aslan, the Senior Vice President of the Business Council of Canada, to get his thoughts on the fiscal update.
Mr. Aslan, first of all, general impressions about this economic update.
So I think what this update tells us generally is that the economy recovered much faster and much stronger than we expected. So you see it by the revenues the government are anticipating next year and the following years. Over 5 years, it's almost $100 billion more than the government expected. For me, that's a big highlight of this false statement.
A lot of people were expecting that the deficit would be lower than it was forecast in the spring because of the reason you pointed to. And yet the deficit is about $145 billion, it's forecast now, compared to $155 billion. A lot of people say that's not as much as was expected, not as much less as was expected.
I think that's fair. And like they did in previous false statements, the government found a way to spend much of the fiscal maneuver they had. A part of it is because of COVID, but part of it is also because of new spending that wasn't there before, pre-election spending, for example, that they put in the fiscal framework. So as you say, it puts the numbers pretty much where they were, a bit better, but not that much better in the short term than they were in the last budget.
So the government has managed to spend a lot of the revenues the extra revenues that they had.
That's correct, yes.
What about, there was a lot of political argument from the Conservatives, for example, that the government should put on hold the almost $70 billion that they promised during the election campaign. Is there any evidence that in this economic statement that they're laying out those expenses that they promised, or have they laid off on them?
So basically what we were told today is that we will have to wait for the budget, for the platform promises to be incorporated in the fiscal framework. They are not there yet, which means that the numbers we're seeing today will get worse, because today basically we got a bunch of good news. Higher revenues due to high inflation, the government benefits from that on the revenue side, and then oil prices were much higher than anticipated. The energy sector was much stronger, and that gave much more revenue to the government. So that's the good news of today. But what we're going to see in the budget is the expenditure side, the government plan essentially from last election being incorporated in the fiscal framework. And I expect from now on, after the next budget, we'll see numbers that will be much less good than today.
So inflation and all of that, what do you make of that if you're concerned about inflation?
Yeah, I mean, inflation will be mainly controlled by monetary policy going forward. The central banks are in kind of a bind right now because they're waiting for the labor market to do much better before they start raising rates. And they don't want to raise it too fast, because if they do, it will create a recession, and people with less income will be affected. So I think it's for the Bank of Canada to manage price control, essentially. I think what the government is doing in the short term is, what will be important for the government is asking itself, do we need to spend all this money, as opposed of repurposing the money for long-term growth investment that will create more productivity going forward.
The day before this economic statement, the government announced a huge ticket item, $40 billion in compensation and reform concerning Indigenous child welfare. part of it would be compensation for the outstanding court case. Have you ever seen anything like that, and what do you make of it?
Yeah, to be honest, I give the government the benefit of the doubt on that. I think this is something they committed to. They had to book it in the fiscal framework. They were transparent about it. They said it would be something they expect they will have to pay going forward. So on that, I think they probably did the right thing today by putting in the fiscal framework.
How big a question mark hangs over this whole exercise because of COVID and the latest variant?
That's a good question. You know, that's what we've learned on the hard part of this COVID crisis is we don't know how long it will take. And I find, if anything, in this statement, that it is a bit of an optimist view of on the recovery side, because, you know, the economy is in a good place right now, but we don't know going forward with this new variant, for example, how people will be affected, how business will be affected, and there's a huge downside that is possible to this. We just don't know, and the government doesn't know. So I think we'll have to see in the budget for next year where we'll be.
A lot of wait and see the budget.
A lot of wait and see. We're in a very volatile, uncertain period, both for the economy and on the fiscal side. So I think it was good for the government today to at least provide an update.
Okay, Monsieur Aslan, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Well, let's bring in three members of Parliament to discuss the fiscal update. Rachel Bendayan is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Associate Minister of Finance. Michael Barrett is the Deputy House Leader for the official opposition Conservatives. And Peter Julian is the Deputy Finance Critic and House Leader for the NDP. It's good to see you all. Thanks for being here. It's an important day. Economic updates always are. Rachel Bendayan, let me start with you. This fiscal update is really a bit of a guessing game in many ways in its projections for the economy, for inflation, for spending. On the pandemic. The focus is the pandemic and dealing with Omicron. What about some of the criticism that you've missed the bread and butter challenges facing Canadians right now, inflation, housing, and other affordability issues?
Well, Peter, we did make an announcement yesterday with respect to the Bank of Canada. Keeping inflation low is absolutely a priority for our government. And as you see in the economic and fiscal update today, we are absolutely committed to finishing the fight against COVID. And we have put aside billions of dollars in order to ensure that we have, the money to buy rapid testing, that we have the money necessary in order to ensure that boosters are free for every single Canadian, just as first and second doses were. And that we are also going to be investing in therapeutics in order to keep Canadians healthy and safe. But it's also a matter of making sure that our economy continues to grow. And we know that finishing the fight against COVID is the most important economic policy for our country.
All right, Mr. Barrett, look at what's happening with the Omicron variant here. I'm just finding out as we speak that rules are changing for caucus meetings here in Ottawa tomorrow for reduced numbers for the sitting in the House of Commons as well. The variant's having an impact. That's clear, and that's where the focus is for the government in this update. What do you think's missing?
They're missing a lot of Canadians who are dealing with skyrocketing prices that they cannot afford. And this inflation tax is affecting Canadians in a way that we haven't seen certainly in my adult life, and we haven't seen in decades. And that's everything from gas to groceries. Certainly the price of a home is it's really running away from a lot of Canadians that not only can they not afford it, they can't even dream about owning a home. But it's really a situation where paychecks aren't keeping up with the rising cost of everything, and no measures included in this update, and very rare mention from this government of inflation in and of itself, unless it's something that's raised by the opposition.
All right, Mr. Julian, why does the NDP believe this fiscal update has missed the mark?
Well, we just went through a $600 million election campaign where the Prime Minister said there are important decisions to be made. Canadians are facing an appalling housing crisis. We have the climate emergency. We have rising food prices. We see more and more Canadians struggling. And the PBO report last week showed that inequality in this country, the difference between the ultra-rich and the rest of us, has reached unprecedented levels, like never before seen in Canadian history. And in response, we have what is a very tepid economic update. It's as if Mr. Trudeau just completely forgot the commitments he said to Canadians on why he was calling the election, that there were important decisions to be made, And what we're seeing now is that the government hasn't made any decisions to respond to the crises and the difficulties and challenges so many Canadians are facing. And when we get to the issue of COVID, one more thing, the reality is they slashed for 800,000 Canadians CERB benefits just a few weeks ago. And now they're saying, well, instead of responding with what is needed to provide supports to Canadians, they are investing in testing kits and in booster shots, but not dealing with the economic fallout that comes with COVID.
All right, Rachel Bendayan, the finance minister lauded the government's economic record on job creation today and the economic recovery underway. I know the focus was COVID today, but we didn't hear any more about the big spending promises outlined in the election campaign. Given the uncertainty ahead, will your government be dialing back some of those spending promises that were talked about in the election campaign, given the uncertainty around inflation, about where Omicron might be headed and the rest?
Well, Peter, I think one thing that is important to remember is that today's announcement was not a budget. It was an economic statement. And so we will absolutely come forward with a budget in the spring. But today was about being transparent with Canadians about our fiscal frame, a very strong fiscal frame. I think the Deputy Prime Minister was right to point to the frankly, very, very encouraging job numbers. We're at 106% employment. We've recovered more than, far more than the jobs that we lost during the pandemic. And we also see a lower deficit than originally anticipated. So I think that this is good news for Canadians. It shows the strength of our economy, and we are doing everything necessary in order to ensure that our economy continues to grow, including fighting Omicron and making sure that we have the room in order to provide the cushion that we need in the fiscal frame in order to respond to the next wave of the pandemic.
All right, Mr. Barrett, I know your party, you've been clear about this, has decried government spending as a driver of inflation. And inflation, we know from looking at the documents today, is boosting the federal tax revenues. What should the government do about that?
Well, look, they need to get their out-of-control spending under control. And every time that the opposition challenges the government and says, look, you do need to control your spending, it is having an effect on Canadians. It's devastating people's ability to live their everyday lives, just to put gas in their cars to get to medical appointments or to get to work. We hear that, well, you know what, it's a global, there's inflation lots of other places. Well, that doesn't do anything for the folks in Victoria by the Sea, Prince Edward Island, or in Vancouver, British Columbia, who are trying to put food on the table for their families. And
what spending would you cut right now?
Well, we need to look at, and C2 is a great example where the official opposition gave the government the opportunity to split the bills so we could focus on the hardest hit sectors, tourism, hospitality, service sector, and then we could actually review the other measures. They waited 2 months after the election to return Parliament and then called for us to bring out the big rubber stamp. So we're very much committed to helping those who have been hardest hit, but the government just wants to continue, what's really runaway spending with very little care or concern for folks who've really been left behind and who are hardest hit by this inflation crisis.
All right, Mr. Julian, are there limits to how much more the government should be prepared to spend?
Well, what we've been saying all along, we need to take a balanced approach. The last big crisis we lived through was the Second World War. We had in place an excess profits tax and wealth taxes, and the ultra-rich paid their fair share, which is why we were able to make all the investments emerging from the Second World War. This time around, the ultra-rich are not paying anything remotely close to their fair share. There is no wealth tax. There is no pandemic profits tax. All of the things that have been suggested that the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer has indicated would make a big difference in terms of balancing the needs of Canadians with ensuring that there are adequate revenues for the federal government. None of those things the Liberals have done. And so what we believe, what Jagmeet Singh has spoken to so eloquently, is having a balanced approach where the ultra-rich and those that have benefited the most from the pandemic actually pay their fair share, which gives us the wherewithal to make the investments that help people, like seniors and students and families.
Do you believe that government spending does drive inflation?
I believe that the affordability crisis happened well before we saw the inching up of inflation. And the critical problems that we're seeing with Canadians affording housing and medication, all of these things predate COVID. So the reality is inflation is something that we need to be aware of. But the affordability crisis that most Canadians are feeling, that predates COVID. And it will take solutions with the government showing real leadership, making the ultra-rich pay their fair share, and ensuring that we actually have the wherewithal to make the investments that will benefit people.
Rachel Bendayan, when you talk about, look, it's not a budget, the budget's coming, but for a lot of Canadians who are dealing with the higher costs of inflation and affordability issues, for 3 or 4 months to a budget might be a long time. What relief can you offer them tonight?
Well, I think what you saw in the economic statement today was relief for seniors. We are moving forward in order to solve issues surrounding GIS and CERB payments. What we also see today is additional spending in order to make sure that money is there should workers have to lock down. And C2 is still before the House. Both the Conservatives and other opposition parties have voted against it. That bill provides support for workers. It provides support for caregivers. It provides support for people who need to leave on sick leave. And I think that all of those measures should be supported by all parties in this House because it's about having Canadians back. And so I encourage my colleagues who are on this panel to vote in favor of Bill C2. And I certainly encourage all Canadians to take a look at the fall economic statement that was released today, which gives a very good picture of where Canadian economy is at and where we're headed.
Mr. Barrett, Conservatives so far have expressed their disappointment and in C2 and saying that you won't support it. Do any of the changes made today in particular, this one-time payment, $742 million to address the GIS clawback from seniors, does that change your view of whether C2 is a bill you can support or not?
Look, as we've said before, we were, as recently as last Friday, proposing to have Bill C2 split to help the hardest hit sectors. That was something that was and has been so far refused by the government. If this was about helping workers, having their back, they would do that first. Why not clear that out of the way, take care of those folks right away? But instead, what we're seeing from the government is that they're planning to raise payroll taxes on January 1st, and that's going to affect everybody, and it's incredibly regressive because the folks who earn the least are going to suffer more than folks who are at the higher in the higher tax brackets as a result of those payroll taxes. So we're going to see carbon taxes go up. We're going to see payroll taxes go up. That's going to continue to drive this affordability crisis that's affecting Canadians. And so until those situations are addressed, and we see that the government is. And that the Liberals are addressing Canadians who've been left behind, we certainly can't support the measures.
Mr. Julian, let me finish with you here. That proposal today, that offer from the government, money in $742 million to deal with the GIS clawback, one-time payment to seniors who've faced the clawback. Does that change the NDP's opposition to C2?
Well, first off, we fought for that, as did many in the public. We've been asking questions about how that is being paid out. If it really addresses seniors that have been critically hit by this clawback, many of them losing their homes, or many of them having difficulty putting food on the table. But I wanted to correct the Liberal Parliamentary Secretary. Her statement about the 10 days of sick leave, which of course the NDP pushed for, is in C3, which the NDP supports. On C2, we moved from 800,000 people getting an emergency response benefit a few weeks ago to zero, because the lockdown benefit applies to absolutely nobody across the country right now, which means,
unless,
of course,
unless we're headed for more lockdowns.
Well, yeah. but at the current situation, we've gone from 800,000 people being supported to zero being supported, and the Liberals need to really move to ensure that people are getting the supports they need at this critical time.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you all for your time tonight. We'll talk again. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
And that's all for this edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen. From all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Take care.